Chapter 3. Unsettling Changes. It had been almost a month since the encounter with Arceus in the depths of Mount Coronet, and life seemed to have returned to its familiar rhythm in Hearthum City. The bustling streets, the lively chatter of trainers, and the warm glow of street lamps lining the cobblestone paths all painted a picture of normalcy. The towering contest hall stood proud in the center of town, its gleaming windows reflecting the golden hues of late afternoon sun. But for Ash and Dawn, things hadn't quite returned to normal. There were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when they felt the memory of that day in the cave return to them, unbidden, like a shadow that lurked just beyond the edge of their thoughts. They hadn't spoken much about it since leaving the cave. They had both agreed that whatever had happened, it was probably best left behind. They had been through strange things before. Encounters with legendary Pokémon had a way of leaving you with questions that were better left unanswered. But this time, something was different. It started with small things, subtle, almost insignificant at first. Ash was the first to notice, though he didn't quite realize it at the time. One morning, after a long day of training near Amity Square, Ash stood in front of the mirror, in the Pokémon Center bathroom, running a towel through his damp hair. He had just finished showering, the steam from the hot water still swirling around the room, fogging up the mirror. Humming to himself, he absent-mindedly pulled the towel away and caught a glimpse of his reflection. He paused. His hair. It looked longer. Not by much, but enough that it caught his attention. Normally, his hair was thick and unruly, but now it seemed softer. He frowned, reaching up to run a hand through the dark strands. It wasn't just longer. It felt different too. Smoother, silkier, almost like he had used some kind of conditioner, though he hadn't. It was the kind of hair that... His thoughts cut off abruptly, and he shook his head, dismissing a line of thinking before it could go any further. Nah, I'm just imagining things. He ruffled his hair, trying to get it to stand up in its usual messy spikes, but it didn't quite cooperate. He sighed and gave up, grabbing his hat and pulling it down over his head. As he walked back to his room, Pikachu by his side, he couldn't shake the odd sensation. His hair had never felt like that before. But it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just tired. After all, they had been training all day, and his muscles were sore. Yeah, that's it. I just need some sleep. Meanwhile, Dawn had been experiencing her own strange changes. At first, it was her voice. She'd been rehearsing for her next Pokémon contest, practicing her introductions in front of a mirror like she always did. "Hi, I'm Dawn, and this is Piplup," she'd say, striking her usual pose with a bright smile. But the last few times she had practiced, something had felt off. Her voice had sounded slightly deeper. Not all the time, just in patches, like there was a strange roughness that emerged at the end of certain words. She'd chalked it up to fatigue, maybe from talking too much or spending too much time outside in the cool autumn air. But the more she practiced, the more noticeable it became. "Hi, I'm Dawn, and this is Pip." Her voice cracked, dipping lower than usual, and she winced, clearing her throat. Piplup tilted its head, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Pip!" Dawn forced a smile, waving it off. "It's nothing, Piplup. Just a little frog in my throat, I guess." But it wasn't just her voice. Later that evening, as she was getting changed, she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror that leaned against the wall of her room. She frowned, her blue eyes narrowing as she inspected her reflection. Her body looked different somehow, subtly, but enough that it made her pause. Her arms, normally slim and toned from years of training and traveling, looked more defined. Her muscles, especially in her shoulders and upper arms, appeared slightly more pronounced. And her legs too. They seemed stronger, more athletic. She flexed an arm experimentally, watching the muscle tighten beneath her skin. Have I been working out more than usual? She wondered, but she couldn't remember doing anything out of the ordinary. Sure, she'd been practicing a lot recently, but contest training wasn't exactly the same as intense physical training. Cup, do I look different to you? She asked, glancing down at her partner. Piplup blinked up at her, tilting its head. It chirruped in response. But its answer didn't give Dawn much reassurance. She shrugged, pulling on her pajamas, and deciding not to dwell on it. I'm probably just imagining things. The days passed, and the strange changes continued. Slowly at first, but enough that both Ash and Dawn began to notice them more frequently. But neither of them said anything to each other. They both assumed it was just stress, or maybe some lingering side effect from their encounter with Arceus. After all, they had been hit with a weird, cosmic energy blast. Who knew what kind of temporary aftereffects that could have? But one morning, about a week later, the changes became impossible to ignore. Ash was sitting at a small cafe in Hartham City, waiting for Dawn to join him. He had ordered a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, with a side of orange juice, and was absent-mindedly playing with the straw in his drink, his mind wandering to his upcoming battle plans for his next gym challenge. Pikachu sat across from him, happily munching on a small bowl of berries, its tail flicking back and forth in contentment. Ash took a sip of his juice, then paused as he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the cafe window. His hair. Again. It was even longer now. Not dramatically so, but enough that it was starting to brush against the back of his neck. And not only that, it looked shinier, smoother. Oh, nee. Hello. He hadn't put any product in it, but it had the same silky sheen that Dawn's hair always had. He reached up, running a hand through it, and felt a strange flutter of unease in his chest. What the heck is going on? It wasn't just his hair either. His face looked different, softer, almost. His jawline, which had always been sharp and defined, seemed less pronounced. His cheekbones looked higher, his skin smoother. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if maybe he was just seeing things, but the reflection didn't change. Pikachu tilted its head, looking up at Ash with a curious expression. Ash quickly dropped his hand from his hair, trying to act like everything was normal. It's nothing, buddy. Just thinking. But the truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about it. His body felt strange, like it wasn't entirely his own anymore. His clothes fit differently, his limbs felt lighter, and there were moments when his voice would crack or pitch higher, almost like it was trying to imitate someone else. Someone like Dawn. Dawn, meanwhile, was having her own unsettling morning. She had woken up feeling unusually sore, like she had spent the entire night lifting weights. Her muscles ached, especially in her arms and legs, and when she looked in the mirror, she was startled by what she saw. Her muscles were even more pronounced than before. Her biceps and triceps had gained definition. Her shoulders looked wider, and her legs appeared more toned and muscular. She looked like she had been doing intense strength training for weeks, but she hadn't changed her routine at all. Her clothes, which normally fit her slim frame perfectly, felt tighter around her arms and chest. Piplup? Piplup chirped, waddling into the room and looking up at her with concern. Dawn turned away from the mirror, forcing a smile. I'm fine, Piplup. Probably just a growth spurt or something, though I thought I was done with those. But the changes didn't stop there. As she got dressed, Her voice cracked again, dipping lower than usual. She cleared her throat, trying to shake the strange sensation, but it wouldn't go away. Her voice had always been soft and high-pitched, but now it felt deeper, more resonant, especially when she wasn't paying attention to it. She frowned, running a hand through her short blue hair. This is so weird. As she finished getting ready, a troubling thought began to creep into the back of her mind. A thought she had tried to ignore for the past month, ever since their encounter with Arceus. Could this have something to do with what happened in the cave? She hadn't wanted to believe it. After all, the strange energy blast Arceus had hit them with hadn't seemed to do any lasting damage. They had both walked out of that cave perfectly fine, right? But now, with these changes happening to both of them, it was hard to ignore the possibility. Dawn shook her head, determined to push the thought away. No. Nay. I'm just overthinking it. This has to be something else. Stress, maybe? Or just a weird coincidence. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Later that morning, Dawn finally met up with Ash at the cafe. As she approached the table, she noticed him immediately. Not because of his usual wide grin or the way he waved energetically when he saw her, but because he looked different. His hair, for one, was longer than usual. And not just longer, it was shinier, almost like hers. His face looked softer too, his features more delicate than she remembered. But what really caught her attention was his voice. "Hey, Dawn?" Ash called, his voice slightly higher than usual, though he didn't seem to notice. "I ordered you some toast. Figured you'd want something quick before we head out to train." Dawn blinked, momentarily thrown off by the change in his voice. Thanks," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. She studied him for a moment, her mind racing. Is it just me, or does he look more like me? Ash seemed oblivious to her scrutiny, though there was a faint crease of worry between his eyebrows. He pushed her plate of toast toward her, then took a sip of his orange juice, still fidgeting with his hair as if he couldn't quite get comfortable. "So," Ash began, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. "Have you, noticed anything weird lately?" Dawn froze, her heart skipping a beat. He's noticed it too. She glanced down at her plate, her mind racing. Should she tell him? Should she admit that she had been going through the same strange changes? Or should she just brush it off, pretend like everything was fine? After a moment, she decided to take the plunge. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice catching slightly as it dipped lower than she intended. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I've noticed some things." Ash's eyes widened a little, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Like what?" Dawn hesitated, then sighed. "My voice, it's been cracking, and it sounds deeper sometimes. And my muscles." She glanced down at her arms, flexing them slightly. "I've been getting stronger, but I haven't changed my routine at all." Ash's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Me too," he admitted, running a hand through his hair again. "My hair's been getting longer, and my face, I don't know, it feels different, softer." Dawn stared at him for a long moment, the pieces slowly clicking into place in her mind. We're becoming each other. It sounded ridiculous, impossible even. But, as she looked at Ash, really looked at him, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. This wasn't just stress, and it wasn't just a coincidence. This was the result of something far stranger, something cosmic. "Do you think?" Dawn began, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think this has something to do with Arceus? With what happened in the cave? Ash didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the table, his fingers tapping nervously against his glass. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted. But I think we need to figure it out. Before it gets worse. Dawn nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Yeah, before it gets worse? And as they sat there, both of them lost in thought, the weight of their strange new reality settled over them like a heavy unspoken truth. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The changes had only just begun. And neither of them knew where it would lead.